Over my lifetime, I've played a ton of Spider-Man games, starting on the Atari 2600 and continuing through to the newest releases. It's been a personal quest of mine to find the games that feel like the comic has come to life. Over the last 2 years, I've put considerable time into every 4th generation home console Spider-Man game. I even released detailed reviews covering every one released on a Sega system along with their SNES counterpart. The question has been lingering since I first got my Genesis with Spider-Man and my brother his Super Nintendo with Spider-Man and XMen and Arcee's Revenge. What was the best Spider-Man game available during that era? When it comes to 4th generation home console Spider-Man games, there were quite a few. 2 developed by Technopop under Sega, 1 by Blue Sky, also under Sega, 1 by Epoch, 1 by Capcom, and 4 by Acclaim, also known as LJN. Being I've yet to cover the remaining standalone SNES games, nor do I expect you to wade through the extensive list of reviews, I'm going to rank every single one from worst to best, giving what I hope is a definitive guide to those seeking a solid retro 2D Spider-Man experience. A couple things to note before I get started. I already know from my reviews that this won't be well received by everyone, and that's okay. You are free to love the games I find to be less than stellar. Nostalgia has a way of tinting our perception about what is good, and my personal feelings might not align with yours. I'll do my best to explain my position without revisiting the original reviews, and remember, it's not personal, it's just my opinion. This is Retro Impressions. What is the best Spider-Man game? You might be wondering if Spider-Man and the X-Men and Arcade's Revenge really belongs on this list, as in a sense, it's not a true Spider-Man game. Yeah, his name is on the box, but you only spend around 20% of the total game controlling him. The reality is when I discuss Spider-Man games with people today, this one comes up, so it seems appropriate to include it here. If you saw my original review, it shouldn't come as a shock to see this ranked dead last. Not only is it the worst Spider-Man game by a country mile, it's also one of my least favorite AAA action platformers on any system. Expectations were set high, with reviews praising the game as the second coming of fun, including GamePro, who gave it a healthy 9.5 out of 10. But man, were they wrong. There are a ton of issues here, starting with the stale, outdated graphics that in no way are appropriate for a 16-bit console. It also has the worst game design and mechanics of any on this list, standing dangerously close to being broken in some areas. The movements of each character are incredibly archaic, resembling something closer to an early NES game. To add insult to injury, the rules for movement change with each character, making it all feel completely disjointed. When Cyclops feels more mobile and athletic than Spider-Man, you know the game isn't going to be enjoyable. It was plagued by development issues as the same team responsible for Wolverine and Silver Surfer on the NES tried their hand at a 16-bit game. The result is one that was rushed to meet a deadline put in place by Acclaim, and it shows. Do yourself a favor and avoid this one unless you love punishing yourself, happen to hate puppies, and despise good games. It's not often a game comes around with exactly the same name as another, but Spider-Man on the Genesis does exactly that. It's typically referred to as Spider-Man the Animated Series due to it being based on the series and to squash confusion when discussed online. This is the typical villain broke out of prison, so returning them is now your sole responsibility. Everything about the game is poorly executed, making for a lackluster experience. The music and effects are driven by Gems, a program sold to Genesis developers to help streamline creating sound on the system. It was intended to be a stepping off point for sound engineers to design something special. Unfortunately, laziness happens, resulting in many development houses using the onboard samples that came packaged with the program rather than creating their own. This is the specific reason as to why so many Genesis games sound the same, giving the system a bad reputation in the audio department. The game is a port from the SNES, but almost the entire game has been changed, including large sections of it being omitted. Because of this, it stands on its own 2 feet, earning a place on this list. Whole stages, backgrounds, boss fights, and more are missing from this version, and what remains is dramatically changed from the original release. The game is very playable, easily beatable, and at times even fun, but the experience often feels like a weird alpha demo that was never intended for public consumption, or some questionable ROM hack of the original game that remains unfinished. A lot of people like to romanticize about how great Maximum Carnage is. The famed Spider-Man beat-em-up contained in a red cart based on a reasonably famous storyline that was also the first decent Spider-Man game to release for the Super Nintendo. The game does its best to remain faithful to the comic, and it's a bit unfortunate because that series wasn't very good and serves as a terrible setup for any beat-em-up game. What is it about Maximum Carnage that people seem to love? Is it the lack of co-op play? The terrible, small, and restrictive level design that requires players to walk back and forth in stages no larger than the ones found in Mortal Kombat 2? Maybe it's the game's brutal and unforgiving difficulty, the lack of enemy variety as there were only 6 unique ones in total, or the overused boss rush, where you face some arrangement of the same 6 villains stage after stage. There's a lot to not like about this game, but the biggest thing for me is how it feels like the Western family of beat-em-ups. If you remove the story and replace the Spider-Man based sprites with Iron Man, Blue Beetle, or even Jackie Chan, someone who's never played the game wouldn't be the wiser. The game does control well and has a great soundtrack, but its uninspired shallow artwork and stagnant backgrounds are unacceptable. If you're looking for a great brawler, get Final Fight, Streets of Rage, or just about any other either system has to offer. If you're looking for a good Spider-Man game, get anything ranked higher on this list, because as both a Spider-Man and beat 'em up, this game is the definition of mediocrity. If you ask people about the best 4th generation Spider-Man game, you're likely to receive a plethora of answers. One game that's never mentioned is Marvel Superheroes War of the Gems. It's an odd admission, being you can play through the entire game as Spider-Man, unlike SpiderMan XMen in Arcade's Revenge. The game is based off the Infinity storyline from the early 90s and takes an interesting approach, allowing you to tackle any level with one of 5 heroes. If you die, that hero is removed and you must select from those remaining. It's a visually stunning game with a solid soundtrack. There are 2 main issues keeping this from placing higher. First off, as a side-scrolling action game, the selection of characters all seem to fit quite well. That is, all but Spider-Man. While I understand that he's the preferred character for many of the game's levels, he doesn't really feel like Spider-Man should. There's no web swinging or real freedom of movement, making his involvement seem somewhat forced. The other issue is that the game only uses 2 of the Super Nintendo's 6 action buttons, one to attack and one to jump. Again, not a massive deal breaker with Hulk, Captain America, and Wolverine, but for Spider-Man and Iron Man, I want a separate button to fire my webs and cannon. It's a competent game, but a poor Spider-Man experience that I can't recommend if that's what you're after. It's fair to say that the vast majority of people who review games do so from the vantage point of value per dollar spent. It's a terrible way to judge a game because expensive ones rarely live up to the value they command, causing reviewers to focus on what's worth owning rather than what's worth playing. And honestly, how many games are worth owning that require a week's paycheck to acquire? So factoring market value into a review is something I'm strictly against. Putting that aside, let's look at Web of Fire. It's a solid experience. Spider-Man does the things that you would expect Spider-Man to do. The levels are large and varied, allowing for some navigation by swinging from your web. Some people feel the game is incomplete, but after playing through it a number of times, I'm not convinced that's accurate. It's more unpolished than it is unfinished. Make no mistake, it's no blockbuster, and there are some major issues such as hitboxes and ledges not registering correctly, along with sloppy controls that specifically affect how Spider-Man sticks and stays stuck to surfaces. It can be a maddening but rewarding experience worthy of a single playthrough. It's a visually appealing game that really encapsulates the era which it's from. Web of Fire features a small but original story and a cast of obscure villains, making it a bit more interesting than the standard fare. Separation Anxiety is the direct sequel to Maximum Carnage. To be quite frank, this might be the only list you'll ever see that ranks the sequel higher. That's because all other lists have an inherent bias. Let me explain. Maximum Carnage was very popular as it was the first Spider-Man game on the Super Nintendo that wasn't garbage, so it sold like hotcakes, ensuring its place as the most well-known of any on this list. Let me get this out of the way. If you grew up loving and still play Maximum Carnage, then this game won't be for you. The main reason being it contains more frames of animation, giving it a distinctively different feeling, one that most players coming from Maximum Carnage can't accept. However, if you're new to both games, then Separation Anxiety is the superior experience in almost every way. When Separation Anxiety released, it didn't receive the press or fan service of its predecessor due to 16-bit consoles falling out of favor with the public. It's kind of a shame too, because while it's not perfect, it's a much better experience in nearly every aspect. The level design, length, and progression are all improved. There is more enemies, stages designed around the main character, a 2-player option, and a story better suited for this style of game, though the iconic comic book panels from the first game have been left out. Back to the issue of how the game controls. As I said, this is due in part to more frames of animation being added to every character, giving it a smoother, more polished look, while also altering the overall feeling. Is it an issue for someone who hasn't played Maximum Carnage a lot? Not at all. In fact, I didn't even realize this was a problem until I had reviewed it and started hearing from people as to why they disliked separation anxiety when compared to Maximum Carnage. Overall, it's another average experience that is good for a playthrough with a friend once every few years, while standing as a marked improvement over its predecessor. SpiderMan on the SNES is the counterpart to the Genesis game I covered earlier. It's a competent platformer that tries to feel connected to the comic and somewhat succeeds. Beyond Spider-Man looking like a professional bodybuilder, the game looks great with a high amount of detail and attention to just about everything you'll encounter. Little things such as Spidey's eyes flashing red to signal when your spider sense is going off really make for a special experience. The levels are long and designed well, but there are some issues. First off, the controls are a bit of a mess. The game is still very playable, but making contact with different surfaces will lead to deep and lasting frustration. It's very reminiscent of the issues Web of Fire has on the 32X, but a bit worse. It's not uncommon to fall through floors, pass through ceilings, or not have your web attached to a surface leading to unintentional falls and death. The game also places Spider-Man on the same side of the screen as the direction you're moving, creating another list of issues. It's a bit of a bummer because everything about this game is grand except for the controls, and that's a rather unfortunate misstep. The cast of enemies and villains is one of the largest of any game on this list, making for an exciting playthrough. My advice is if you're a die-hard Spider-Man fan and can put up with frustrating controls in addition to lousy collision detection, then purchase this game. You might be unaware of the Amazing Spider-Man Lethal Foes because it was developed in and remains a Japanese exclusive for the Super Nintendo. That unfortunately means this story-heavy game is inaccessible to all but a small number of my viewers. A English translation patch was released in 2015, but requires you to be savvy to those things. Still, if you decide to import and play through it like I did, the menus are in English and knowing Japanese isn't required to enjoy the full experience. As with most Spider-Man games on this list, there are some control issues, though they are less notable than the other ones mentioned. It's a good looking game with great animations, but some of the boss fights are a bit stale. There's also the issue of almost no variety in standard enemies. It's not Maximum Carnage bad, but it's close. Overall, it's a fluid experience that I highly recommend as a fun, short, easy game that is worth at least one playthrough. It's also the only game on this list guaranteed to be accessible to anyone who picks up a controller. Well, this is awkward. The Amazing Spider-Man vs. Kingpin could be considered the definitive version of a game that's yet to be discussed on this list. I did an in-depth review on this, but to be clear, it's a very different experience when compared to the original to the point it could be considered a remake. It's a great game that alters the original in nearly every way, along with expanding the game and story. This version allows you to explore much of the city, adds animated cutscenes, a new soundtrack, redesigned and new levels, new moves for Spider-Man, a pinball game, and new villains. It's a fantastic must-own game, and the first on this list I feel everyone should own or play without any caveat. So, with all the praise of the remastered version on the Sega CD, you might be wondering how the original Genesis version takes home number 1. For me, the flow of the storyline and immersive experience are what put this game on top. Now, I'll admit that it's a close call between the two, and I wouldn't argue with someone who felt the Sega CD game was the better version, but for my money, I love the original story. The pacing, the music, the dark alternate endings, the fact that your job as a photographer matters, made this the standard bearer for what a Spider-Man game in 2D should be. A standard set at the launch of the Genesis and never surpassed as we moved into the 3D realm. It's the first time I ever played a superhero game where I really felt the comic was well represented and not a tool used to sell a less than average experience. It was a milestone of excellence when it released, and it still holds the status quo of the bare minimum requirements I believe a game should include to properly represent a superhero experience. Those being stages built around a character's abilities, incredible gameplay, a moveset designed around the hero's strengths and abilities, an interesting story, and something that humanizes the hero. Because for most of us, that's what sets our favorite hero apart from just another guy in a white stormtrooper outfit. That's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Feel free to leave a positive or negative comment letting me know your thoughts. If you would like to chat or keep up to date on channel-related news, follow me on Twitter at Jenovi. And until next time, you've been watching Retro Impressions.